If there was no TV in sight and you heard the Friends theme song, you'd likely know what was playing on the screen. You'd settle on the couch with your snacks and have a general idea of the type of entertainment you're about to consume. Well, a podcast intro is no different than a TV opening, and it can be one of the most important parts of your podcast. For those who have just stumbled upon your show, these crucial seconds are the make or break that decide whether or not they're gonna stick around. Hey, this is Yvonne from Spreaker, and in today's episode, we're going to be talking all about how to create the perfect podcast intro and outro. But before we do that, if you find this video helpful, smash that like button and make sure to subscribe to the Spreaker YouTube channel. So what is a podcast intro? Well, it is a short audio clip, typically 30 seconds or less, that introduces listeners to who you are, what your podcast is about, and why they should listen. If your podcast begins and launches right into content, a new listener will have no idea who you are or what your show is about. Now, think of a podcast intro less as a catchy, fun slogan and more of a way to introduce yourself to a new connection. You don't necessarily need to make a song or a jingle, but you do need to explain who you are and what your show's about. But before you start putting pen to paper, first visualize who is listening to your podcast intro. Who are you speaking to? The way you speak to your audience and the type of ambiance you create in those first few seconds will differ depending on if your podcast avatar is a 40-year-old yoga mom or a teenage heavy metal bro. You'll want your language and tone to match that of your ideal listener, giving them something that they can easily recognize right off the bat. Once you've nailed your podcast avatar, the next step is to choose your podcast intro structure. Now, there are basically two types of podcast intros. Now, the first one is the pre-recorded intro, where your show is introduced by someone else and talked about in the third person. Now, hearing another voice introducing your podcast will add some diversity to your audio. It can also jazz up the tone or ambiance you're aiming for. It will allow your audience to think of you less as a one-man show. Instead, they'll see you as an expert who deserves an introduction. Now, the cons of using this type of intro are that you will need to hire an audio producer or a voice actor to create an intro for you, which could be expensive depending on your budget. Typically, you can find people to do this on freelance markets like Fiverr. Now, the second intro is the self-recorded intro, where the host will typically introduce themselves in the first person. They will also give a bit of a rundown of who they are, what their goals are, and what their podcast is about. The benefit of introducing your own show is that the audience gets to know you from the jump. They can also hear your passion for the subject in your voice. You can set the tone for your podcast quickly, as your audience will understand the mood in which you're approaching your subject. When your audience realizes that you're a real person, you can also create intimacy between you and your listeners, making them captivated by all that you're saying. So how do these two intros sound like? Let's look at two examples.
Welcome to the Lilac Bullock Show, a show where the world's top entrepreneurs share their stories and their insights into finding motivation, getting inspiration, and reaching success.
Welcome to Passport Mommy. I'm your host, Michelle Jerson. This show is for anyone raising little humans. We feature experts with tips and advice to enrich the lives of our children. Mom and dad entrepreneurs tell us their inspiring stories.
Once you've chosen the style, then it's time to sit down and start writing your podcast script. Here are 4 tips to consider when writing your podcast script. The first thing is introduce your show. You don't need to go into great detail. Give a quick one-liner explaining what your show is about and what your audience can expect to hear from you. It goes without saying that you should directly mention your podcast title as well. Now, the second thing you want to do is introduce yourself and any co-hosts. So whether you want to use your real name or not, your audience needs to know who is speaking. You can explain a bit about your connection to the podcast subject, but saying your name and the title is usually enough, as you want to keep everything short and sweet. The third thing that you should do is acknowledge your audience. Since you have already carved out your perfect podcast avatar, you should know your target audience. Including this in your introduction will allow your ideal listeners to recognize themselves immediately. Something like, "Hi, I'm Hannah, and this is Bird World, a podcast for bird lovers." Now, this example cuts straight to the point, and your audience can decide quickly if your show is for them or not. The fourth thing that you should do is set the tone. Your audience should know straight off the bat what kind of show to expect from your introduction. So if your show is comedic, make your intro lighthearted and funny. If it's serious, avoid any strange sound effects. You may want to choose to add music to your intro, which can be helpful when editing. Although it's optional, adding music to a podcast intro can quickly set the mood you're aiming for. Now remember that if you are going to use music, do not use copyrighted music in your intro. While a podcast intro should aim to be somewhat static and easy for your listeners to recognize, some podcasters like to follow this up with a sneak peek of what each episode is all about. Podcasts such as The Director's Cut include a short summary of their current interviewee's latest project in their intro, giving listeners a sample of what's to come over the course of the episode. While it's optional to include a full episode preview in your podcast intro, you might want to mention the episode number or title in the beginning, given that you don't have a pre-recorded intro. Now that we've talked about the do's, let's quickly address a big podcast intro don't. Details. Your audience will have the entire course of an episode to find out more about your podcast. The bulk of your content is what matters to them, so don't spoil everything in the first 30 seconds. Your podcast intro is a teaser, and it should give just enough to pique a listener's interest and get them to stick around to listen to the whole episode. Now, once you finalize the podcast intro, don't forget about the outro. While some people may start tuning out as your show wraps up, a podcast outro is a good way to transition out of your show. Since it does come at the end, an outro doesn't hold the same importance as an intro, but you should still put some thought into it. An outro is a simple way to wrap up your show and send your listeners off into the regular world. Like a podcast intro, your aim here is to be brief. You can include the same music as the intro, but you should change it up in terms of the script. In your outro, you should include a CTA or a call to action and also thank your listeners. It's a good idea to part ways with your audience by giving them a clear call to action. Some CTAs include your social media handles, asking listeners to write a review, where to find your podcast community, such as Facebook or on Discord, how to sign up for your newsletter, or a reminder about your Patreon. Along with the CTA, make sure to acknowledge your listeners and thank them for listening to the whole episode. While your content is great, your podcast would be nothing without your audience. Adding notes of gratitude in your outro is a nice way to show your listeners that you care about them. By regularly mentioning your audience in your show, you'll be building a community and increasing their loyalty to you. And that's exactly what you want to do. And there you have it. Did any of our tips and tricks surprise you? Let us know in the comments below. And as always, if you love this video and want to see more, smash that like button, subscribe to our channel, and click the bell to be notified when we share a new video. And if you have any questions, please comment below and we will be more than happy to answer them in a future video. Until next time, happy podcasting.